Okay, I think we can start. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this 105th CPR-CSH workshop. We are back at CPR. This time, for those who were not present last seminar, remind you that conference or workshop was held there on the future of India. This conference was brilliantly moderated by Parto, and you can find this conference online on CPR and CSH social media. So today we have the pleasure to welcome Eric Verdet. For those who were not this morning at the Hybrid Energy workshop, I remind you that Eric Verdet is Professor of Geography and Urban Studies at Sciences Po Paris and researcher at the Center for International Research. Eric, your research deals with the political ecology of urban infrastructure, which you studied in several Middle Eastern cities, with a particular focus on Beirut. You are as well coordinated the collective research Hybrid Elec. So, Eric, traditionally you can use 45 minutes or 1 hour for this presentation, and it will be followed by a round of questions. The talk is yours.
So thank you very much. Thank you for all. Well, thank you first to the CPR and the CSH for this invitation to their joint seminar, a seminar which is now quite famous among French geographers and people from the urban studies. And so I'm very proud of being of talking in front of you this afternoon. Thank you also for organizing all this week here in Delhi. For me, it's the first time there, and so it helps me a lot to better understand the situation of Indian cities, and so hopefully to reflect back on my own experience as a geographer and urban planner in Lebanon and in the Middle East. I am, to be honest, a little bit scary about my presentation this afternoon, because when I think about what Lebanon is and what Beirut is in comparison to this gigantic urban world that India that India has become over the years, I am really asking myself, but what could they learn with the Lebanese case study or the Beiruti case studies, which I'm going to talk about now. Indeed, in contrast to this morning, where we try to understand how more or less things are working, or how people in cities, ordinary people, business entrepreneurs, international agencies, local authorities, of course, are making things work, making infrastructure work to catch up with urbanization. Now, this afternoon, I'm going to talk about more a story of failures, of failed infrastructure, failed reforms of infrastructure, well, this is in a way a very negative story, and so to be clear, the purpose of this presentation is not to draw lessons from to emulate the Lebanese case and Beirut. I hope so, not for people here in India, but more maybe at a reflective level to reflect on what we do as social scientists when we try to understand the states, and how the states work, in that way, I hope that we can find a terrain for exchange this afternoon. So, the starting point of this story is the fact that several infrastructure, several basic services, basic and essential services, are really not functioning, are really badly functioning in Lebanon, and it has become particularly visible and spectacular in the recent years. So, almost 30 years after Lebanon ended its civil war that divided the country for almost 15 years, the political situation is still far from stable, and this has an effect on electricity, particularly, because electricity is still not available 24 hours a day, and to be honest, in some part of the country, it's sometimes 12 hours a day that they experience power cuts. So it's really a major and spectacular failure, despite a number of investments during the years after the reconstruction, after the end of the civil war, what is known as the reconstruction, a process that was heavily funded by international organizations. So electricity is, for the ordinary Lebanese, a major subject of protest, of anger, and just to give an anecdote, when the power cut is happening, it's the kind of regular load shedding. So when it's turning on or off, and when it's turning off, the Lebanese people think, well, ejet daoulé. That's when the electricity comes. It means, well, the state came, and when the light is off, they say, well, it went off. So you see here very symbolically also the association that people make between electricity, the service of that symbolize modernity, and the state, and a properly functioning state. Things went worse in the recent years when not only electricity but also waste began to show spectacular signs of failure. Indeed, during the summer 2015, the main dump site in the region of Beirut was closed by the very angered neighbors, which supported the environmental unhealthy effects of the garbage, smelling gas, etc., in their vicinity, and they closed very brutally, but after several warnings, the road to the dump site, meaning that suddenly waste began to pile up in the streets of Beirut, and of course you can imagine all what it meant. Smokes because of burning the waste, leakages, a lot of animals growing on the streets, etc., etc. And this story of what to do with the waste has been up for almost 3 years, from temporary situations to temporary situations. So at the first moment, they tried to store the waste under the bridges, etc. Then the rain washed the bridges and washed the riverbed, and all went into the sea. And this image of that you have on this on the screen precisely represents one of the moments when the first rains after the summer came and brought all the waste into the streets. It was, of course, awful. And all this. Some of the cars are half underwater. And yes. So it's not streetscape. Riverscape. The streets. No. There are real cars in a sea of waste. or in a river of waste, and which shows that the problem is not only with waste and electricity, but also sanitation, also rain drainage, etc. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of infrastructural problems in this country. So after several rounds of temporary solutions, they ended up in dumping, still temporarily, the waste into the sea. But it is still unclear what to do with the waste, and of course this has prompted a lot of public protests, but that have not really resulted in any political change. Okay. So this leads to a question, a very naive question. Well, this absence of infrastructure can be interpreted as a symbol, as a sign of an absent and weak state, a state that lacks finance, that lacks expertise, that lacks also will to reform. But this is something paradoxical, because when you know Lebanon, when you know the Lebanese people, they are very smart. This is a country where there is a lot of money. They attract a lot of international money too. So really, it's a paradox and it's a puzzle. And this is what I wanted to unpack, try to unpack at least, and I will offer you some reflections on that issue in this presentation. How to explain the state's failure? I would say that mostly in urban studies, there have been two dominant narratives. The first one, which has a very strong international appeal, claims that neoliberal policies are to be blamed for this failure. Why? Because the state has been undermined by reforms that have considered private sector entrepreneurs and firms better suited to deal with those issues. And in so doing, they followed, of course, international injunctions by international money lenders, by big firms that were lobbying in order to advance their solutions. And in the case of Lebanon, the neoliberalization of urban management is at best represented by a very big mega project that has happened, that has unfolded in Beirut in the last 25 years, which is called Solidaire. Solidaire is the name of a very big private company that is redeveloping the city center of Beirut, the one that was largely distracted by the fightings in the city center of Beirut, and that after the war, a private company has been granted the right and the legal means to expropriate, to rebuild. And this project, which at a certain moment before Dubai and other very big developments in the Gulf start, this project was almost one of the biggest in the world, and it represented the strength of the public sector in Lebanon and India's their ability to change the environment and to, in a way, reconstruct the city. However, this project, 25 years later, well, financially it's going well. It's providing profit for the shareholders. Great, thank you for them. However, indeed the result for the inhabitants, etc., has been dramatic, because it has never allowed the former inhabitants to come back. And so Solidaire, it's really the incarnation, the representation of the neoliberal, the bad effects of neoliberal transformation, and therefore it is also considered as a symbol of this state failure. A state failure that was organized by the state itself. Of course, it's necessary to say that because it's the state, the councils of ministers and other institutions that took a law allowing this project to develop, etc., etc. So this is the first narrative, which is very, very big in urban studies. The second narrative is more local. It's called, we can call it sectarianism. It's the tendency to understand, to interpret the transformation on the ground as a result of the political fightings between different political groups which are associated with the Sunnis, the Shias, and various Christian groups that are fighting together politically, I mean, but also allying together sometimes. And of course, this story is very clearly associated also with the tendency of the political leaders of the different political religious groups to appropriate resources in order to give their partisans and their followers diverse retributions, both symbolically or politically or economically, like jobs, like housings, etc. So a kind of clientelism, which is, of course, not a specificity of Lebanon, but which in Lebanon is very, very strong. So two dominant narratives that goes along, or that comes with the idea that the state is undermined, the state is weak, the state is captured by different groups external to the state, or that penetrate the state in order to fulfill their own interests. Okay. Recently, this narrative has been challenged by several scholars who have trying to propose alternative understandings, and precisely they have shown that some institutions are not paralyzed, as is, for instance, the authority or the authorities that manage infrastructure. When they look at the Central Bank of Lebanon, that has managed to maintain a kind of monetary stability for 25 years, or when they look at the army, the Lebanese army, that is more or less succeeding in its missions of maintaining order in a country which is always shaken by geopolitical turmoil. So they contend, using various approaches, Marxian approaches, Foucauldian approaches, I'm not going into detail, that the weak state explanation is not enough to understand things, and that we need to understand other things, that understand the way different groups are also using sometimes a strong state for their own interests, etc. So I am building on this debate, and I think this, of course, also is connected to a wider literature about weak states, not only in Lebanon but in other contexts. What I am proposing in this presentation is to look at infrastructure as a policy instrument, and by doing this, to try to promote another approach to state action, to public policy, that has been foregrounded at the start by my colleagues in Sciences Po, particularly Lascoum and Le Gallès. So they define a policy instrument, and here you have the quotation, as a device that is both technical and social, that organizes specific social relations between the state and those it is addressed to. According to the representations and meanings it carries, it is a particular type of institution, a technical device with the generic purpose of carrying a concrete concept of the politics, society relationships. And it is sustained by a concept of regulation. So, policy instruments is a way to look at and to conceptualize public actions, when public action is not just about power fightings or is not just a political economy, but is something that is structured by legal instruments, sometimes material instruments, that help us understand the action of state and public authorities in the long run, because these are institutions that they exist in the long run. They are not just the result of a moment, instant relationships. And one of my colleagues has already started to consider infrastructure as a kind of second-rank institution. That is an institution that is able to, in a way, to govern cities, even when cities can seem ungovernable. I think you already heard Dominique Laurin in this arena. No, but Marie-Hélène has worked with Dominique Laurin several times, and so Laurin made the argument that in very big cities, what he called XXL cities or megapolis, where usually it's very difficult to find a kind of political agreement, a political consensus. There are always political fightings between different parties. Nevertheless, he noted, very often infrastructure work not that bad, and we can understand that as the result of low-level agreements. That, political groups can consider infrastructure as things on which agreements can be sealed and which allowed for the duties of cities to be fulfilled, like economic growth, etc., etc., etc. So, in a way, less important institutions, but also important, but that can be left out of the political struggle more or less. Okay, so this is this literature that has interested me to develop my point here, and I'm going to do that now. I'm building on that, but with a paradox, of course. It's that, in my view, the case of Lebanon and the case of Beirut precisely denies this positive and optimistic representation of infrastructure as second-rank institutions where agreements are settled. Because, in my view, in Beirut, no agreement is settled and things are going always worse. So this was the start of my thinking. I'm going to make three arguments, 3 points, based on the analysis of the waste sector, waste management sector, and the electricity sector. First of all, I will insist on the fact that infrastructure is, in that case, and I think in most cases, is a site of political struggle. So political infrastructure are contested. The management of infrastructure is contested. In contrast to a certain view that view infrastructure as a technical affair that can be managed by economists and engineers together. Okay. In contrast to that, I maintain, no, it is a site of political struggle. Why? It shows that for politicians, there are political and social effects to be expected from the working of infrastructure, and they want to reap the benefits of these effects for themselves. Okay? Therefore, it is the site of a battle. Second point, I will show that this is the case in Lebanon, at least. reforms that have been attempted, that have been undertaken, have until now resulted in very limited effects. There have been a lot of reforms or attempts at reforming the sectors. However, very, very limited effect as a result of the political infighting between the different sides and the fact that no parties has taken over the others. So it's a result of the political situation. But because it is a situation of blackmail and exchanges of favors, I give you this very small measure in exchange for that measure, etc. So it's blocking the situation and it's preventing things to be done in the long run. But as I will contend, if there is limited effects of these reforms, but it doesn't mean that the instruments that are embedded in the management of infrastructure are not producing effects. In that case, it is very bad effects, as I will document, very strong and splintering effects, but they show that state institutions work. The problem is that they don't work for the public good, but they work only for an unintended bad for the general society. So I'm going to, in detail, I'm going to see that through three types of instruments. The first of all are the operational boundaries of the infrastructure utilities. The second is the kind of PPPs, public-private partnerships that have been set up and that have not performed very well, as I already explained. And in the end, I will also look at the question of funding. Who is paying for whom in the end? Who's benefiting from the money that is poured into the management of infrastructure? So first of all, the waste crisis. The waste crisis, well, as all the infrastructural issues in Lebanon, started during the civil war. And since the city of Beirut was divided in several parts dominated by militias, with a green line separating the two sides of the city, it made the circulation of people, of goods, very difficult, and also of this particular category of good, if I can say, that is waste. And so they decided, what remained of the public authorities at the time, decided to allow the municipal, it was a municipal company, to pour the waste into the sea, and it is the brown form that you see nearby the port of city, just in front of the city center of Beirut, the place that were mostly targeted by infighting, and which produced also, along the years, a lot of rebels that gradually were also removed into the sea. So you can see that in Beirut, landfilling the sea was a process that started during the civil war. But it was not the only side where they did that, and also in another part of the city, in the place called Borj Amoud, they also started to dump waste, and that they continued it even after the civil war. And so I want to show you that on the map. So first of all, what is very important to say is that after the civil war, this dump into the sea was, of course, it was not possible to remove it anymore. And so the planners started to think, how can we use that? And we can use that to develop the city center on the sea. Okay? And you can see on the last image on the right that they have developed a very big scheme for creating, well, a financial center or maybe other ideas, because at the moment it's still not developed, but they finished the landfilling, they reclaimed, they cleaned it, and so it became a major extension of the city into the sea. So the second point where they started to develop a landfill on the sea is the place of Borjamoud. And you see here this big mountain of trash that has developed mostly after the end of the Civil War, because the Normandy landfill in the city center was now closed. So they developed another big dump site, and they closed it only 7 years after the end of the Civil War, so in 1977. And at that time, they also started to think about developing it as a land reclamation, so to clean it and to develop it for various equipment, infrastructure, such as a waste, water treatment, for instance. And this is what you have on these plans. Unfortunately, the project did not develop at the time. But what was implemented was nevertheless, we can say, a neoliberal reform of the waste management. And they created a company called Suclean. And here you can see a picture with of these tracks, which claim to have really reformed the waste management, and they picked up all the waste and they put it now in a dump in the mountain. So the city, for 20 years, the city appeared as cleaned up every day. It looked like it worked well. However, over the years, it was shown that the cost of this company was very, very, very expensive. It increased every year. It was also discovered that it had several connections with several politicians, several political groups, and that probably part of the profits were in the end used for political uses or just for the personal profits of some political personalities. And so in a way, this privatization process, it's a very clear case of privatization, is precisely illustrating the wrong doings often associated with neoliberal reform, lacking a transparent monitoring process. And one of the bad sides of this managing process, apart from the financial mismanagement and mishandling, was the fact that the waste were stored in a dump site in the mountain without abiding to environmental norms, and so it produces a lot of unhealthy effects, which in the end angered the people living nearby, and which led to the closure of this landfill. And it was the start of this process, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And then it appeared that the competent authorities for managing waste, the municipalities, were totally bypassed. They could not control, they could not monitor anything anymore. And this led the state to look for a solution to solve the problem. And therefore, in the end, they created again landfills, And you can see here on this map, on this picture, the former landfill inherited from the war and the new projects that they have already begun to fill. Okay, and with the idea to create land where they will be able to develop, for instance, a sanitary station for wastewater, but also to develop real estate projects. So you understand that waste becomes like the primary resource to build the city, and you can see that Beirut, in a way, is a city built on trash. Of course, this has a very strong environmental impact. This could also have strong social impact. If these lands are indeed developed, they will be sold at a higher price, so they will not be able to cater for the needs of the most disenfranchised people. And so we have also this bad side of the management of the waste crisis. So we see that the instruments used by the government, the PPP, and also the plans, the master plans that have been drafted 20 years ago, but that continues to have an influence on the ideas and the project of planners until today, are maybe not directly what the government followed, but in the end, their imprint on public action has been very strong, and we cannot deny that in a way, and maybe inadvertently, but in a way, it has led these catastrophic dump sites into the sea are the result of state action over the years, and not of just an hazardous and random process. Okay. Now I'm switching to the analysis of the electricity crisis. Just as in the case of waste, we have a very long crisis of electricity, and shortages of electricity started during the Civil War also. And despite strong investments during the reconstruction, the electric output never catch up with the demand. When I was living in Beirut at the beginning of the 2000s, in Beirut proper, in Beirut itself, that is the very central city, we had no more power cuts, or almost no more power cuts. So 24 hours of electricity. But just beyond the boundary of Beirut, there were power cuts. And after 2006, when Israel led a war in Lebanon, but also because internal problems of management and decaying infrastructure in Lebanon, the power cuts began to increase, and until the situation that we are facing today, that is about 6 to 12 hours of power cut every day. What does it mean? It means that in the everyday life, the Lebanese people are people who have always enjoyed, or not always enjoyed electricity, but that they have enjoyed electricity for many years, and it means that their ordinary life is powered. It is an electric life. They all have fridges, they all have electric appliances, etc. So we are not in the case of societies that are transitioning toward electrification. It's not that case. So the Lebanese need electricity. They need it. What do? They have developed diesel generators that have spread now everywhere in the society, meaning almost every household has its own generator or is buying a subscription to a collective generator at the level of the neighborhood, or at the level of the buildings, and it has become a flourishing sector that is tolerated by the state, and even, as I explained this morning, gradually more and more regulated by the state. For instance, now the Ministry of Energy publishes every month a suggested price for the kilowatt hour produced by a generator based on international markets for oil and what it costs, etc. So it is illegal, it is informal, but it is in the state and managed in a way by the states. And here you can see two examples. So on the right, it is the national utility. They have been unable to invest in new power plants, so they are renting a boat from a Turkish company, and they have actually currently 3 boats in front of their seashore that produce about 1/3 of the total output of the national company, and it is just they burn diesel, and so it's generators on a boat. Okay. And everywhere in the streets of Beirut and the country, you see those generators, very big devices that are very polluting, very noisy, that produce also a very big part of the electricity that is consumed in Lebanon. And of course, this sector has become very, very strong, I mean, economically. It means also that you need to import a lot of fuel to fuel these machines, and it is widely believed that the people who import fuel have become a cartel that some accuse of preventing the reform of electricity in Lebanon. At least these are the talks that we hear when we are in Lebanon. And the fact is that almost no reforms has been implemented. There have been a lot of plans to transform the sector. Plans for privatization, partial privatization, corporatization, etc., etc., etc. It's only recently that a minor reform has been undertaken regarding distribution, and they have allocated 3 regions to different companies, private companies, that have replaced the national utility in this job. But despite whatever the performance of those companies, which are different from one to each other, the main points that have surfaced regarding the implementation of this reform was the fact that the workforce employed in this sector has been very, very manipulated by political interests, and it was very clear that these jobs that were private jobs, that were working for the national company, they were recruited on very political and sectarian basis, and so it was very clear when they implemented this reform that what prevented the transformation of the wool sector was the fact that there were very, very strong political interests for not changing the game, because there was a lot of financial and political benefits to reap from the status quo, if you want. Oops. So now I would like to shift to the second part of my electricity story and analyze in more details the question of who pays, who doesn't pay, and who is paid or who receives money. There is clearly, in the continuation of what I just said, a strong issue with fraud and sectarian clientelism. Here you can see a quote from the Ministry of Energy and Water, who claims that is a Christian people, and he claims that the ones who are responsible for the management, the bad management of electricity in Lebanon, are the Muslims because they don't pay their bills. Okay, So broadly said, we see through this quote how the sectarian narrative has become strong and is also preventing any moves, because when one minister said, let's start with this, the other said, no, but you say that because you are Christian or because you are Muslim, etc., etc. You don't want to change, you want to reap the benefits of the reforms, etc. And it ends up in doing nothing in the end. So this approach, this part of the problem is very strong, and it has been calculated that this costed the state or the national utility 300 million every year. But there are other factors, and my research has shown particularly that the uneven geographic supply that is also implemented, which I have already explained, is also producing very, very strong effects that are usually not very well known. The official tariff for electricity, so the quoted kilowatt-hour charge, is in white on this chart, in principle progressive. So it's a kind of block tariff where the smallest consumers pay less than the biggest. So at the start it was conceived as a social mechanism for the benefits of the poorest people. However, it has been shown, here it's a World Bank study, that in practice, when you really take into consideration all the fixed costs, it results in making the poor people to pay much more than the other part of the population. And you see that the first black sticks represent the charges effectively paid by the people, and they show that the poorest people pay more. In addition to that, I've been able to make a calculation that also shows that because the city of Beirut receives more electricity, and because this electricity is much more is subsidized according to this scheme, which I just presented, it results in giving a lot of money to the people of Beirut, whereas the other part of the situation, the population, which represent a huge part of the number of subscribers in red, have less subsidies than their share of subscribers in blue. Okay, so in addition to subsidizing the more rich, the way electricity is distributed also favors some region, and in particular the capital, which already receives more electricity than the other part of the country. Okay, so a very unfair and very uneven mechanism. And this mechanism is precisely the result of the agreement or of the way the policy instrument is calibrated. So here again, what we see is the undesired but effective, very effective consequences of policy instruments. And therefore, my conclusion is that when we think about the way the state works or is not working, indeed we think about what the good state should provide. Okay, but the way it works in reality shows that the state mechanisms are working. The problem is that they are not regulated in the proper manner. Okay, so in a way, the problem is not a lack of state. The problem is really the fact that the state is not regulated enough. So I come to my conclusion. What I have shown in this study is the fact that, first of all, there are great differences between the two sectors, and if we take into consideration water management, it's also different. So it's very difficult to find one explanation, one-size-fits-all mechanism, And this is also why the very broad analysis about neoliberalism are not working, are not proving very efficient, because they are too general. And we have to go into the details of every political arrangement, of the materiality and the technical subtleties of that are running the sector. We see also that there is no geographic convergence between the way these infrastructural sectors are managed. This is very important, particularly if we think about the fact that in Lebanon, sectarianism is a very territorial object. I mean, sectarianism has been implemented through the civil war, through territorial conquest. So there was one Christian territory, there was several Muslim militias territories, and for the militia, controlling the space also usually went with distributing services. But what we can see here, with this fragmentation of the map of services, is that the map of servicing the population is not corresponding to the militia territories. So it's not. I mean, the sectarian system is prevalent, is strong, but it has not pervaded totally the system. And still, the state institutions are organizing the service according to their spatial categories. So it is not a case where a company owned by just a militia would serve its own population. This is not the situation that we have. What we see also is the fact that the neoliberal reforms, there were many, but they were absolutely or very barely implemented, and which shows also the weakness of the explanation through neoliberalism. And in the end, there are a lot of stories in the Lebanese context about the sectarian explanations of the crisis, politico-sectarian explanations. Indeed, it's true that sectarian fightings are preventing reforms to be undertaken. But what is usually not shown, well, not understood, and that my research in particular, but others also are showing, is the fact that the non-reform has very strong social effects because of the way the policy instrument is working. So, in a way, as I said, the state is producing effects, even if these effects were probably not intended, not desired. But nevertheless, for instance, here the mechanism of redistribution of subsidy, it is a state-managed process, and it is producing effects that are increasing social inequalities in Lebanon. So this is the lessons that I draw from this case study. As I said, it's more a way to understand the way it works, and my conclusion is a call for never taking the claim that state is weak too loosely, and to really analyze how the state works on the ground. Thank you.